Thank you, Rex. So this first part is kind of the blah, blah, blah kind of part of my presentation, and it covers kind of the general stipulations for what traditional cultural properties are. Tribes have a little bit different, they have a broader umbrella under which traditional cultural properties might be, but this is the guidance from the National Park Service, and I think it came out in the early 90s. I can't remember which year right off the top of my head. But these are the things that a traditional cultural property has to kind of convey. It's got to be part of a living group or community. You can't, apparently, you can't say something's a TCP if it's from a people that are now no longer extant. There has to be continuity for that group or community. They've got to be still viable, part of the world. Shared beliefs rooted in the community. It's got to be something central to their belief pattern about the unique way in which they see their environment. And there's got to be a continuity of the cultural practice. Apparently it can't be a tradition that's no longer practiced. But one thing that, as a tribal member, one thing that you might push back with is that some cultural practices may lie dormant for many years, and then they're revived in a fashion that maybe adapts to this modern lifestyle that tribes are trying to survive in. The beliefs are important to the continuity of the group or community. It's something that the location or the belief kind of conveys values that help that people to survive in the world. They must be transmitted to the next generation. Oftentimes, these locations or places convey beliefs and values that can only be, they can only survive if you have younger people that are embracing those beliefs and conveying them on to their children and so on. And they also, as I said earlier, they kind of have to have a location. Agencies like that because it means boundaries. Agencies operate within boundaries, and that's just the unfortunate reality that tribes face, is that oftentimes you have to have a location with a boundary outside of it. And that poses a big dilemma, and I'll go into that a little bit. It must be associated with the practice. As an example, we have story sites that I'll cover a little bit later, and the practice is the oral tradition. We have stories about Coyote, we have stories about all the animal people, and we can point to various places and say that's where that happened, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. Oh, thank you. Criteria for eligibility. This is where we're starting to kind of, split hairs. There are different property types, and like Rex was saying earlier, there's a variety of different traditional cultural properties, and the tradition kind of it can be embraced by a variety of different people. It can be embraced by historians. It can be embraced, obviously, by Indian people. There are oftentimes districts. You'll see historic districts marked off in some of the bigger cities where you can see remnants of the old buildings that were there when maybe a city was first founded, that kind of thing. Buildings, structures, objects. Sometimes they're elements of the natural landscape, and they have to have integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And so essentially what that means is they can't be too, they can't be changed too much. Okay, good. So then there's criteria that kind of drive this, and a lot of times they have to be associated with significant events. You'll see like Civil War battlefields, Indian battlefields where we were kind of in conflict with the U.S. military. Association with significant persons, as an example, that's the place where, that's Lincoln's cabin, for example. The work of a master, an example of that might be somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright, a famous architect, or maybe Coyote. They have to yield info important in prehistory and history, and where the interpretation of this comes from a tribal perspective, or at least for the Nez Perce, is Like, the work has to be a part of our history, and it conveys some sort of important information, such as values and beliefs that kind of guide how we live our lives. And this one is a really cool one, because this is where kind of the rubber meets the road between tribes and agencies, and the documentation must come from the perspective of the people that see that property as significant. And myself, Nakia Williamson, others, we've done documentation work, and it's very, very rewarding, because we get to learn about things as tribal people from elders by taking them out and letting them visit the landscape that we're trying to take care of. And we get to hear things that that have basically been dormant in our eyes for maybe 2 or 3 generations, because people go out there and they visit the landscape and things come to them, because our lives have changed so much that for some Indian people it's been some time, it's been decades for some of us since we've been to a certain place. And so those stories, they get brought back. The elders, they breathe life back into these things, and some of this documentation is actually dormant in archival resources. And so that's pretty cool too, because we get to travel to different places, and like we've found Coyote stories that reference points back home in archival facilities, and we never did know that they were there. Okay, go ahead. So these are some of the things that the Nez Perce feel are important places. And this one right here is actually just across from our casino, where you can make your wildest dreams come true. That's the Clearwater River Casino. And the cool thing about this story is that this is where it all starts for the Nez Perce people, because we talk about this point in time where there were only animal people, and they all came together because of a prophecy about a great change that was coming to their world, and this change would be brought by 2-legged creatures. And so they argued a little bit, because some of them wanted to just basically say, well, if they're going to change our world, let them go, let them die. We don't want to help. But then others said, no, we need to help, because that's the way we are. We're animal people. We take care of one another. Even though we have our challenges, that's our way, and this is no different. And so among the first ones to step out was Salmon, and he said, I give my entire bodies for these creatures to survive. And that set the precedent. All the other animal people stepped forth and took roles that basically would eventually enable the Nez Perce people to survive. And out of it came Coyote's role, because he was trying to be everybody else, and then finally they just said, well, why don't you be the person that goes on to create these ones? And Coyote, he was thinking to himself, man, what an incredible responsibility. But what he said was, oh, that's what I was going to do anyway. Well, the animal people, they reminded Coyote, exactly the way that you are, these people are going to be too. So you got to remember that. And they kind of chuckled, because Coyote, he was always getting himself into a jam because he was chasing after food or women. And they said, Coyote, you're also very forgetful, and you're late. But what we want to do as animal people is we want to make sure that when these people come to be, after you create them, that they can point to this spot and they can say, that's where the animal people came together for us. That's where they offered something of themselves. They announced their sacrifices that they were going to make to help us to survive. And so some of them, they pulled their robes up over their shoulders, and they became the rock outcrops that you see up there. Do we have a laser pointer? Looking for the pointer here. So up here to the top is where those animal people are, the ones that chose to mark the spot, and this is a close-up of them. You can see how they're kind of standing there with their robes up over their shoulders. And then down here, these are the ones that were even later than Coyote, and they turned to stone too. But what this story talks about is the importance of the establishment of a role of elder kinfolk and junior kinfolk. And that's really important for us as Native people, because we're so fond of the animal people and so thankful for what they did that we always comment on what they do for us. And a lot of the material culture that we wear for special ceremonies, you'll see that reflected. And like for many plateau dresses, you'll see a little bit of hair that's left in the center of a woman's dress. And that's what that was interpreted to me as is that's the law, because you recognize that animal because it came forth and it gave itself to you. It gave you food, it gave you shelter, it gave you clothing, and so always be thankful for those old ones that stepped forth for you. And go ahead and go to the next slide. So Coyote got his marching orders, and he eventually, he was down there at Celilo, and he was breaking apart the fish dam, and he overheard this commotion about this creature named Iltsueltich. And Iltsueltich was the inhaler, and it was inhaling all the animal people. And so Coyote went up there, and he eventually tricked this Iltsueltich into inhaling him. And there he went down into that into the throat of that great creature, and he tricked that monster into inhaling him so that he could eventually cut that monster's heart out from the inside. And he went back and forth, in the challenge, trying to get this creature to inhale him. But he secured himself to 3 different spiritual points in Nez Perce country until eventually those ropes broke, and then there he went down into that monster's body. But eventually he cut that monster's heart out, and all the animal people, they went to all these different places, and they were diving out with their the bones of their relatives that they didn't make it. And they say that that's why the Nez Perce people are so endeared to their old ones, is because that's what the animal people showed them. And so that's not a value that's uncommon for many Indian people. Across the world, they always are endeared to the locations where their loved ones are buried. But this is the heart that remained that Coyote cut out, and we call that place Timnapa, and we deem that as the genesis of where the Nez Perce people come from. Okay, go ahead, Angela. So one of those places that Coyote secured himself to with the rope is Tumloihismex, and this is one of the places that young people were taken to when they were 5, 6 years old, and this practice continued on into adulthood for many people. But children were taken up there, and they were dropped off, no food, for days on end. And it was because they were expected to make some sort of a communion with those spirits that came forth and pitied them. They were taught to go up there and humble themselves so that that spirit would come and say, all right, you live your life like me, and I'll take care of you. And the things I will teach you, you can take back to your family, and you can take care of them. And your family will help your community to survive. And that's the way that you'll be. And so some of those kids, they came away with powers that later manifested as being a really good fisherman, or being a really good root digger, basket maker, all that kind of thing. Okay, go ahead, next one. So this one here, I selected this for a couple of reasons. One, because this one shows destruction. This is called Groundhog's Root Peelings, and this is probably about maybe 5 miles up the river from where I was raised, near Lenore. And my grandfolks would always point to that place and say, that's where the peelings are. And the story that they recited was that Groundhog was sitting there, and she was busy peeling her roots. She dug all these roots, and then she sat there with this great big pile, and she peeled them one by one, and she kept throwing the peelings over her shoulder like that. And Coyote came along and reminded her, you need to take those root peelings and take them back to where they came from. And she said, yeah, okay, and she busied herself, she kept peeling, and then pretty soon she had all the roots all peeled, and she was ready to put them away. And she looked behind herself like that, and she noticed, oh no, I didn't take those root peelings back. And Coyote said, well, I reminded you. And then he turned them to stone. He said, that's going to be for the people when they come. They'll look at that and they'll say, oh, we got to take our root peelings back to the grounds. And so that basically conveys a sense of respect for place where things come from. And another thing that Simon said when he offered himself in that first story was that he was going to give himself for the people, and he would travel to far-off places, and he would bestow gifts upon the people upon his return. And then he laid down some covenants. He said, but they have to allow me to die in the place in which I was born. And so what that did was it established a sense of connection that many Indian people are fond of, in that they try to return things to their original source. They try to respect that cycle that's necessary for those things to continue. And so you'll notice that the highway kind of cuts through Groundhog's Peelings right here, and a lot of that was taken away when they put that highway in. But most of the site retained its integrity, you might say, because we can still point to that site even though it's damaged. And agencies are still responsible for protecting what's left of it. And it's because it fits all of those criteria that we went through initially. And another reason why I selected this photo is because of this little culvert right here. And our old Nez Perce people, they talk about this creature that looked like a great big toad, but it had the face of a human being. And there was a stream that it lived in. And the Nez Perce people were always respectful of that stream because of that reason. They knew that that creature lived there. Well, later a highway came, or a road was put through there, and it destroyed where that creature lived. And what they say is that that creature, it temporarily left, and then it came back, and it took up residence in that culvert. And our old people, they say, yeah, I used to see that there. They talked about its presence. And so that might pose a problem for an agency, because they might look at a culvert. This isn't the one, obviously, but they might look at that culvert and think, well, no, that's not important to Indian people. But yet there's the story. And it's not about whether or not this creature was real. It's about the belief pattern that was established through the endorsement of the validity of that creature within the context of the culture from which it came. Okay, go ahead, Angela. So here's another one that's across from the casino, and I couldn't get an image of it, but there's actually two rattlesnakes. There's another rattlesnake down here, and this is the older rattlesnake. And these ones they were talking about, these rattlesnakes, they were talking about how to get food. And they were saying, well, I know how to get a rabbit. He kind of travels through here every once in a while. And so what we'll do is we'll trick him. We'll have him run down to you. This is what the older rattlesnake was telling the younger one. And then you can jump out and scare it, and then it'll scare it back to me, and then we'll share it. But the older rattlesnake, he was thinking to himself, yeah, I'm going to eat that whole thing when I catch it. And Coyote, he's kind of watching all this discussion take place, and he's just waiting. He's thinking to himself, yeah, this is a good one. This is a good one to capture. So he watches all of it take place, right? The younger rattlesnake gets up here, and the older rattlesnake chases it, and the cottontail doubles back like that. And the older rattlesnake, he's just about ready to latch onto that little rabbit. And Coyote stopped it like that. And he said, that's going to be for the new people when they come. They'll look at that and they'll say, older ones shouldn't disrespect the younger ones. And so basically what that talks about is how those that are older or more experienced should not take advantage of those that might not know something. Because if you do, you'll have a reminder. Okay, go ahead. And so this is another example of how beliefs are conveyed through a story. This one's about Ant and Yellowjacket. And again, Coyote, he's going upriver, and he hears this fighting going on. And Ant, he was on this rock, and he was eating some dried salmon. And Yellowjacket came, and he said, that's my spot. That's where I always eat my fish. Move out of the way. And Ant said, no, I want to eat here. You can have it after I'm done. And they go back and forth until eventually they're yelling at one another. And Coyote, he warns them. He says, you guys quit fighting. This is going to come to no good. And they kept at it. And pretty soon, they're pushing one another like that. And Coyote warned them again. And they didn't listen because they came back and, just like kids, they said something like, well, I was here first, growling around. And it escalated again until eventually they're locked in arms like that and they're grappling about. And Coyote, he came up and he clapped his hands like that and turned them to stone. And he said, that's going to be for the new people when they come. They'll look at that and they'll say, don't fight because that's how you'll end up. But the deeper meaning of this is that, the way that my grandparents told me is that when you look at that, it's a good example of what happens when a person is compelled into an action out of the fear of loss or out of outright desire. And my grandparents would say, you're going to go through that your entire day. You're going to be defending things, or you're going to try to take things from other people. It might not be possessions, but it might be status, or it might be something else. You have to be aware of that, because if you don't, your heart's going to turn into a rock. And what that does is it hardens your heart if you're not aware of those kinds of things. And so the way that it's interpreted is that the one that was afraid of losing something was Tumsoy the ant, because he didn't want to lose his spot. Well, Yellowjacket came along, and he wanted that spot. So he was willing to mistreat the ant over trying to get it. And Ant was willing to mistreat Yellowjacket because he wanted to keep it. And because neither one would give, they both turned into a rock. So that kind of is an example of like the hardening of the heart if you're not aware of those things that are acting in your mind. Okay, let's go to the next one. This one right here is a place along the Columbia River, and there's not very much that the people in my family know about this one, but that doesn't mean that some other family out, other Nez Perce family or another Indian people might know something about. But this one is supposed to be a woman that was she was kind of being greedy with fish. And Coyote went and turned her into a rock too and said, well, there you're going to stand with your bag of fish, and that's where you'll be. And so that's where she is right there. And down at her feet is supposed to be a bag of fish. But my older brother was telling me about that one. Okay, go ahead. This one here is called Miscleitas. There's a couple of names for that. Miscleitas, Miscleitas, Miscleitpa. And what it translates to is the place of wedding bundles. And this is down on the Columbia River. And you can see that right here, that rock has been blasted away for the progress of the highway. But there's a whole bunch of these out there in the middle of the field. And my grandmother was saying that a long time ago, Coyote was looking for a mate, and he wanted to basically show the people how that union was supposed to be formalized, how it was supposed to be recognized by the community. And so these are all wedding trade bundles that are scattered throughout the field here. You can see another one back there. But Coyote got together with his mate, and they had this big family trade where the women would give certain things and the men would give certain things. And that was basically the way that marriage was recognized, because it wasn't formalized until that wedding trade took place. And there are also trades that take place for like when a baby's born and other things. But that place is recognized as the symbol of how Nez Perce people are supposed to come together when they find each other like that. Because when you come together as a man and a woman, it's not just the union of those two, but it's the merging of families. Because a lot of resources are going to go back and forth between those individuals' families. And even though that one's destroyed, we still deem that as important, even though there are a bunch of these big monoliths that are chipped away at. Okay, go ahead. Traditional cultural properties can also be fishing places. These are property rights, as some might call them. But this is our elder, Elmer Crow here. He's at a place called Yawinma. And the continuity of this place is easily demonstrated because we have elders like Elmer Crow that take his grandchildren down there and they fish. Now, how this is problematic for an agency is that what they want to know is, where are the particular areas that you fish? Because we can protect that. We can be aware of that. But the easier question is, well, where aren't the Nez Perce fishing? Right? Because Elmer, he doesn't live his life any different from any of the other Nez Perce elders. If he's fishing, he's going to go up and down that stream bank. And then he's going to try to get over on the other side and fish all the way up and down that stream. And he's also taken along his children, his grandchildren, and he's showing them, these are the places that we fish, and this is how you do that. Because dip netting, even though it looks easy, and it's a lot of fun too, actually, but you're passing that net through the water like that and trying to catch those fish as they're coming upstream. and you're really working with that current. And what's easy to do is, if you're not aware of how the bottom of that stream is, you can easily hook up your net on one of these rocks like that. And you're going to fight against the velocity of that water to try to get that net back against it so that you can unhook it and then continue fishing. I've done that before. And it's not easy to get yourself out of a jam like that. But this place that we fish is called Rapid River, and the name is Yawanma, and what that means is cold water place. And there's a story about how Coyote was down there fishing, and Grizzly Bear came, and he elbowed Coyote out of the way. And he said, "This is going to be my fishing place." You know, he was all big and hulky, and, you know, poor Coyote, you know, being little, he couldn't put up any fight against Grizzly Bear. So Grizzly Bear just pushed him out of the way. And Grizzly Bear, he sat down and he put his tail in the water, and he goes, "Whoa, Yowitziwis, you know, that's cold water," because it's direct runoff from the Seven Devils. And so he stood up and he goes, "Man, I'm going to call this place Yawanma, the place of cold water." And so that's one of the old Coyote stories that go along with that place. And we also had a big fish war here where the state felt that it had jurisdiction over Nez Perce tribal fishing rights. And this came to a point where numerous tribal members were being cited over fishing in Rapid River by the county, and for they channeled them through the county, and I think there were 2 or 3 dozen Nez Perce that got routed through. They eventually dismissed it, but the backstory is that the state of Idaho felt so strongly that they had jurisdiction over Nez Perce tribally reserved treaty rights that they mobilized the National Guard. The state of Idaho mobilized the National Guard to stop Indians from fishing. We're glad that played out the right way. No loss of life. But when I was about maybe 10, 11 years old, I was there. My mother, she would take us down there and camp, and my older brothers, they would go down there and fish, much like Elmer is right here, but they would be doing it in the dark time. And my mom would wake me up and she'd say, "Go down there and get those fish from your brother." And I'd rub the sleep out of my eyes, and I'd kind of, "Oh, okay, I'll go find him." You know, I'd be whispering real loud. And then finally he'd say, "Well, come over here and grab these fish right here. Remember, stay low." So I'd be dragging these salmon, you know, just this little guy dragging these big salmon over. And I'd take them back home or back to the camp, and then I'd lay down. And I asked my mom, "Why am I doing this in the dark? There's nowhere else that we have to do this in the dark. Why am I getting fish in the dark?" And she goes, "You go out of the tent and then you look back up there at the ridge and you'll see why." And so I walked out there and I looked, and there was a game warden way up there on the hill. And every while he'd pull out his rifle and he'd kind of glass things out. And I came back and I said, "Oh, now I understand." And see, later I asked my mom, you know, "Why did you put us into that situation as young kids?" And she goes, "Because I want you to remember something." She said, "Don't you ever put your life on the line for a fish. On the other hand, are worth fighting for." And that hit home with me, because that's why these Nez Perce were putting their lives on the line, in order to make sure that my sons, when they come to be, they can go up there and fish in exactly the same way that Elmer does, the same way that I do, my father does. And we've had this connection with this for a real long time. Actually, a funny story kind of comes to mind, and it has to do with the early historic period. There was a bunch of Nez Perce that were encamped on this river. And the main group of Nez Perce decided, we're going to go up the hills there and we're going to fish. And then after that, we're going to go up on top and we'll hunt a little bit. And there were these 2 older couple, man and a woman. They said, no, we'll just stay down here and fish. And so the rest of them left. They went upstream. And those 2 older ones, they stayed back. And the man, he got up and he goes, "Oh, I'm going to go down here and try it out, you know." And so he was going down there. And then pretty soon, he was gone till it was time to eat. And the missus, she goes out walking, looking for him. And she's walking down the river, and all of a sudden she can just faintly hear, "Oh, touched one." Quiet again. "Oh, touched one. Oh, touched one." And then pretty soon she's thinking, what's this guy doing? She keeps walking along. And then finally she gets in a place where she can see. And there he is. What he did was he took off all his clothes like that, and he crossed that river, and he got onto one of the boulders that was out in the middle of the stream, and he had his gaff hook like that. He was reaching around in there. And every time he'd touch a salmon, he'd try to yank it out of the water like that, and he'd miss it, and he'd go, "Oh, touched one." He was just close to catching a salmon. So here's the humor of our tribal women. She decides that she's going to play a trick on him. So she looks around, and she finds one of his gaff poles, and she takes the hook off, and she's waiting, and he's like, he's got his pole in the water like that, and she reaches out, and she taps him on the tullets. And she yells, "Oh, touched one." I like to imagine that maybe he jumped in the water at that point, but my uncles, they never did say. I'm just pretty happy that she took the hook off. All right, next slide. So this is a place called Sawis Nima. It's a digging place where we get our camas roots, or what you guys call camas. This is my wife's great-grandmother, and she's digging that camas, and it's a lot of work. This is also the place where the Nez saved Lewis and Clark. It's not far from this actual place where we're digging. But TCPs can also be these kinds of things, obviously. Like the picture shows, we've got great-grandfolks that we're digging out there, and we don't even know how long this story goes back, but it features as part of that heart story where Coyote slew that monster. One of the things that he did before he went down into that monster's throat was he threw out all of these plants that his elder told him to gather. And just before he went in, he would throw off huckleberries, and he'd say, "That's where they'll get huckleberries. That's where they'll get camas, and that's where they'll get bitterroot." And just before he went into the monster's mouth, he said, "That's where the new people will go for all these foods so that they can live." And so this is one of those places, and it's directly linked to our Genesis story. And we still harvest here, and like some of the things that Native people are concerned about, and this is a agency and public challenge, is that when we go and we gather these plants, a lot of times the Native people will know about the healing qualities of these things. And we don't want that to get out. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of those reasons are that many outsiders do not know how to take care of these resources in the way that we do. You have to know the windows of when these plants make themselves available. You have to know how not to overharvest them. You have to know which part of the plant to get. You have to know how to harvest it. Because there's one plant where if you peel the bark downward, when you drink the tea from it, it'll clear out your system. If you pull the bark upward, it'll make you vomit. There are some plants where one part of it's poisonous and it will kill you, and the other part of it's food. And some of them, they don't even work when you gather them at the wrong time. So there's a very, very complex body of ethnopharmaceutical knowledge there that we don't want to get out, because some people actually do kill themselves. It's very rare, but it does happen. So that's just some of the concerns. Other things that we're concerned about are when we have places that have names with them, or we have archaeological sites, that kind of thing, we're really worried about people looting and vandalizing these places. And we've had places that have been vandalized where, racial slurs have been put up. People have spray painted, left beer cans, all that kind of thing. I mean, all manner of dysfunction kind of tends to manifest when young people are doing things they shouldn't be at places like this. It's very unfortunate. Okay, go ahead. Another form of traditional cultural properties is battlefield sites. The Nez Perce tribe in 1877, in effort to escape the military, went on this trek that took us through Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and numerous battles took place. And every year we go back to those same battle sites and we dress up our horses in their finest and we dress up ourselves and we ride on those places. And we have memorial ceremonies. Some of our elders will get out their pipes and we'll sit around, and the public actually is invited to these things. But they only happen once a year around the time that the battle took place. And that's a place where we're going to remember those sacrifices that our older ones took for us. And again, in recognition of that elder kinfolk, junior kinfolk relationship. And this is something that that has taken place for quite a number of years. And for a long time, the Nez Perce people, they couldn't even go to these places because that trauma was so strong with them. And there are still to this day Nez Perce people and non-Indian people that go to these places and they remember these things, the stories, and they cry. Powerful and moving this experience is. And yes, it's traumatic. The better side of that is that you can label that as historic trauma or you can label it as cultural resilience. And my people taught me that it's cultural resilience because look at what your old people went through. They went through that. What are you going to accomplish in your life? How can you give back? So that's the kind of guidance that we give in places like this. So this is Whitebird Battlefield. It's near Grangeville, Idaho, and it's probably one of the places where it's the first major battle in the Nez Perce War, and this is the place where we really took it to the U.S. military. Okay, next slide. Oh, this one's actually out of order. This is supposed to be earlier. This one's Yakupa, and that's a black bear place. And again, this is a lot of these stories kind of have to do with fishing places, but Black Bear was at a place on the Clearwater, and he was fishing, and he was taking all the fish, and Coyote, he was getting upset about that, and they went through their little, exchange. And eventually Coyote came, and he took Black Bear, and he threw him up on the hill, and he said, that's where you're going to be. And because of your pride, you're going to sit there with your head in the air. And so that's the general outline of that black bear. You can see him sitting with his snout facing up that way. So it's important to share, right? Okay, go ahead, Angela. This one here is what we call the Duck Sisters. And this one, again, is not far from Groundhog's Root Peelings, not far upstream from where I was raised. And what happens with this one is that these little rocks right here are what are called the Duck Sisters. And what they do is, the story goes is that they were put in the water like that, and they were tied to creatures like elk and deer and moose and that kind of thing. But the rising and falling of the water is part of the significance of this site. And say if you put a dam and you inundate that, then what happens is we lose our indicator of when it's time to go into the mountains to get elk. Because what they say is that these Duck Sisters, they show themselves right about the time that the elk begin to bugle. And that kind of announces when the hunting season kind of kicks off. The only exceptions to that being, like if there's a special ceremony and you go out and you might want to get something in the springtime or early summer, or if maybe there's famine and you really need that food. But you have to have that justification in place because that's what these ones are here to remind us of, is that now the time is taking place where you guys go out and you start gathering and preparing. You put away for the winter. Prepare yourselves. And so it's directly tied to a constellation as well. But go ahead and go to the next one. So here's another agency challenge. This is Rattlesnake Mountain. And it's generally that stretch right there. But one of the things that we push the agencies on is part of what makes these areas significant is what Native Americans see from when they're standing at those places. Because we, of course, want our environment unchanged. We want it to be in the same way that our old people kind of maintained it. And so one of the things that we press agencies on are you doing your best to make sure that that remains in the same way that my grandmother or my grandfather saw it? That's really important to us. And so this being Rattlesnake Mountain, you can see all of these brown areas right here are the places that you can see from that area. Now that's just from right there. I mean, if you walk back and forth, all of this kind of eventually fills in, right? That's a big challenge for the Department of Energy. And I'll admit, that's not easy to deal with. But yet there's something that has to be hashed out because these places are important, and I'll describe why later. Okay, next one. All right, so this one, we're getting close to the end here. You can put this one in, maybe it's better not to know file. Coyote was going upriver, and he heard this pounding noise. And that really perplexed him. Well, he went over there and he looked over the ridgeline like that, and there were these 5 sisters down there. Oh, they were just beautiful. Hard working, their black braids just glistened in the sun. And that really aroused Coyote. And he thought, man, if I could have one of those girls, I'd be all right. You know, he looks down at himself. And by looking down at himself, I mean, he was looking down at his manhood, his male member. I don't want to say penis because I'm kind of shy. But he goes, oh, I'm just a mere coyote. It's not going to reach all the way over there. They won't be impressed. And then he watches those women, they're pounding on the roots like that. And he sees that when they pound on them, they get a little bit longer. Oh, I got an idea. He whips it out on a rock like that. He grabs another one. He nails it like that, and it grows. And oh, he just howls like that. And he's surprised because it worked. So he keeps pounding and pounding and gets longer like that. And then finally it goes into the water and he's feeding it over like that. You know, he's just holding it in and he's pounding it like that. And then pretty soon it gets over where those girls are, and they decide to take a break, and they all take their dresses off and they jump into the water. And they're all washing like that. And Coyote, he's trying to feed it into one of them. And she jumps out of the water, the oldest one. She gets out of the water and she goes, there's something in there. It tried to crawl up in me. The other 4 say, nonsense, you've been working too long, you're too hot, you better get out and rest. Then the next one does the same thing. She jumps out, yeah, she's right. And then pretty soon it goes through all 5 of them and down to the youngest one. And the youngest one, she's washing off like that, and she feels the same thing. And so she reaches down and she grabs it, and she looks at it, and then she sees across the river, and there's Coyote busted, right? He immediately yanks it back like that, and he reels it in, and he throws it up over his shoulder, and he cuts out running. He's got this big old thing over his shoulder, and he thinks, I'm not going to carry this around. And then he thinks about those girls when they're pounding those roots, they break apart, right? And he goes, oh, that'll be the trick. You know, he lays it out like that. He puts it in this big coil, and he pounds it and cuts it off, and he says, that's going to be for the new people when they come. They'll know how Coyote was. And so he left it in a big old coil like that. Well, that's the place that you see right here. So Coyote left that there. And later, this is now, I think it belongs to the state of Washington, but yeah, they own it, right? So the state of Washington, they came and they took about half of it away and they turned it into riprap. So if you're ever driving those long roads through Washington, you'll know why, right? But the thing about this is that I grew up with this story ever since I could ever remember. I always heard my gramps and my dad did stop along the way, and they'd get out, and this is where they'd stretch their legs and they'd point over there and they'd laugh. And I always, like I said, I always grew up with this story. I tell it to my boys. My boys chuckle just as much as you guys do. They're 9 and 12 now, and these stories, they serve different roles. They're geography. They help us navigate. Whenever we would come back from, say, over here at Priest Rapids or Seattle, over there at Umatilla, my boys, they'd start to get excited, especially my older one. He'd say, "Oh man, we're getting close to home." And I'd say, "Tomasa, how do you know we're getting close to home?" Because, he's a little 4-year-old mind, 5-year-old mind, just kind of getting curious. And he'd say, "Oh, because there's Coyote Simca right there." It's navigation. But additionally, the funny thing is that sometimes Coyote, he was just that way. And this one right here, there's a couple of things. What it says to women is, don't let men take advantage of you. What it says to women, or to men, or to young boys rather, is don't take advantage of women. Because if you do, they will remember. Okay, next slide. So this is a story that I was telling the young people yesterday. No, it's not that bad. It's basically how Coyote tricked these 5 wolf brothers into the sky, and these are 2 grizzly bears, and they're looking at this thing called Lukup Simai. Lukup means something that shakes or wavers, and Simai means to be without it. So they're looking at something that doesn't move. And Coyote tricked them all into going up there, and so these grizzly bears, they point out where this thing is that helps Nez Perce people navigate in the early days. Because we traveled so far from where that heart of the monster is that we would rely upon that until we got to know the landforms that helped us to travel. And so the story is really important because not only does it give us a navigational aid, but it also gives us a coping mechanism. Because when I was young, my old people would tell me, go out there and you find that star. And I'd go out there and, geez, there's so many, where do I start, And eventually I'd find it, after a little bit of reminder, I'd be able to point it out. And they'd say, what's the cool thing about that star? And I'd say, well, it doesn't move. I said, yeah, no matter what happens, that star is always in the same place. That's where your heart and your mind are supposed to be. Again, all these things are going to be coming at you throughout your day. That's your reminder. And this story is so powerful, this teaching is so powerful that I was talking to one of the old guys, and he was saying, one of my uncles was incarcerated in the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam. And he said, all his day's struggles, all of that strife, all of that worry, everything that he went through in that day would be taken away when he would go outside and he would try to find that star. That's how powerful these things are. And I know this works because one of my boys was bitten by a spider. Not only do I know it works in my life, but it works for our young people too. After he got bit by a spider, he had to go to the doctor and he had to get a shot. And the doctor came in with that needle and he was just weeping. He was so upset. And I turned to him and I said, hey, we all get struggles. But we also get teachings so that we can face those struggles. And I said, look up Simai. And his composure just changed. He stopped crying, he dried his eyes, and he took that shot, and he didn't cry after that. So I know that these coping mechanisms work. And it's really important for me to be able to walk across my landform like this and look up and see these things. Now that's a challenge for an agency because there's no boundary with that. Right? Where are you going to draw a boundary from where you can see the North Star? But yet there are things that they can do because if they have a structure that they're going to be putting up and they're worried about security and they have to have lighting with that, maybe they don't need that lighting on all that much. Maybe they can just kind of sporadically make it come on. Our community back home in Lapwai, it does that. Some of the lights will come on for like 5 minutes and then they'll turn off for 15 and they're set kind of erratic like that. So there's things that agencies can do to kind of help us to maintain this connection with our landscape. And that's really important because this is my closing point. A lot of people, they go back and forth about, what's so important about tribes? Well, yeah, they're really cool, but what role do they play? For me, as an American citizen, that's not a tribal member. I was reading a book called Vanishing Voices, and it was talking about how no matter where you're at in this world, if you lose an indigenous language, the biodiversity is not far behind. Now, you've all heard the illusion, canary in the coal mine. Lots of canaries here. Not just language, cultural practices, the presence of those people themselves. So our role here is much like, if you look at that very first story that I told, we're the elder kinfolk here. You guys are the juniors. We're the ones that you turn to for guidance. Because nowhere else are you going to find the experience of how to survive in Wanapum country from other than the Wanapum. Same thing for the Nez Perce, Yakima, Umatilla. You go to China, there's indigenous people there. You go to Russia, same thing. Their experience works. And so that's the thing that we're trying to invest in a lot of the agencies that come to us. We're trying to help them to understand the way that we look at the world really matters in this place. And without us, we all perish. Indian people are no better than anybody else. But yet, we have a very unique relationship with the land that ensures our survival because it's a sensitive one that's been honed over thousands and thousands of not just years, but generations. Thank you.